Welcome back. My name is Silvia Lindtner. I'm the Associate Director of the new Center for Ethics, Society and Computing, which spells ESCAPE. I'm also an assistant professor in the School of Information here at the University of Michigan. And I'm really excited that you all will be joining us for this second part for our official launch event called the ESCAPE Plan. The panel that we're about to start in a couple of minutes is on the topic of culture after tech culture, unimaginable, question mark. But before we kick off the panel and before I introduce our panelists, I just wanted to say a couple of logistical things. We'll proceed with a Q&A as we proceeded with the previous panel, but in case you didn't join us or were unable to be here for the previous panel remotely, in terms of how you will actually be asking the questions, we'll have an online questionnaire tool that we use to take questions both from the audience and from remote participants. And you can find the URL for that online question tool on the website ESCAPE, so esc.umich.edu, and we'll also display the URL here on the screens for the people here in the room. This panel will run from now until 4:45. At 4:45, we'll have some closing remarks, which I will be delivering. The closing remarks will also include some details for the reception that will follow this event for all the people who are attending here in person. We're very excited about that. So stay tuned also for the details on that. And we noticed that a lot of people followed our invitation to take photos of our ribbon cutting ceremony. So please do send us those photos, either to my email address or Christian's or the center's email address. It's all okay. Great, and I think we'll get started with our panel. So I'll just give a little bit of background on what motivated this particular topic. So the provocation that this panel poses to its panelists and also to you, the audience here in the room, is really a question about modern progress and the promise of development and innovation itself. And in some ways, we ended up talking quite a bit about that even in the previous panel. But here, I think we're going to really approach it from this question of cultural processes in both regional, global, transnational contexts, which all of our honorable guests here have expertise in. So just as a little bit of a background, over the last 10 years, we have really witnessed a proliferating distrust in the tech industry, and we just talked about that at length. Technological promise and technological solutionism in particular, so the idea that complex societal problems can be solved with technological fixes became increasingly difficult to hold on to sustain. More and more people, not only scholars, critical thinkers, but media outlets and really broader publics began talking about the deep entrenchment of computing with things like precarious conditions of work or with the advancement of neoliberal capitalism and financializations of many aspects of our lives, with old and new forms of labor exploitation, from the gig economy to the endurance of sexism and racism in tech and engineering industries and fields. And yet, despite all of this, the belief in technological progress and the promise of innovation and development as an inevitable path is still with us. Like even in the previous panel, it was very difficult for us to think through what are alternative models of technology that take us beyond development, forward movement, innovation, future thinking as sort of an inevitable endpoint. So it is a widespread argument, for instance, too, that the latest wave of technological frontier making, no matter if you think of artificial intelligence or the Internet of Things, smart cities, autonomous vehicles, or the automation of farms, is bound to happen. It's inevitable because it's supposedly happening due to some inert law of technology. And so all we can do is kind of adapt, stay competitive, avoid falling behind. So that's sort of a typical story. So innovation in this kind of framework that we still sort of hold on to is bound to happen, and we can't really do anything about that. So what we invited the panelists to think with us about today is to speculate on, can we think and conceive of culture and cultural processes beyond that inevitable path of that culture is inherently a tech culture? Or what kind of tech culture or how we might differently conceive the relationship between technology and culture? And can we, or rather should we, imagine technology and technological culture in ways that differs from this sort of much more broader, dominant ideological view? So with that, I'm delighted to introduce our guests. Due to time, I will keep my introductions brief and really can't do justice to their incredible work. I will go in alphabetical order and just ask our panelists to raise their hand when I name them. And I picked one key accomplishment of our panelists to highlight broadly the area of research. But I also really invite you all to go to their websites. We have linked in the online program to learn more about their work. So our first panelist, André Brock, is Associate Professor in the School of Literature, Media and Communication at Georgia Tech. His forthcoming book, Distributed Blackness, African American Cybercultures, published with NYU Press, which I had the great privilege to see a book presentation of yesterday, which we hosted also through Escape, intervenes in widespread conceptions and perceptions of what counts as technoculture, so quite related to our panel's topic today. His theorizations of black cyberculture do not end with the capture of blackness, but begin from a deep understanding of the digital artifacts and practices informed by a black aesthetic. Michaelanne is a presidential postdoctoral fellow and assistant professor in the School of Information here at the University of Michigan. As a sociocultural anthropologist who works on internet cultures in Cuba, her work challenges widespread notions of innovation in design and computing, while focusing on the creative practices that take place at the intersection of citizen-led information systems and struggles with mundane infrastructural breakdown and constrained resources. She explores deeply the issues of power and privilege that are often masked and hidden in more celebratory embraces of the grassroots. Holly Okonkwo, to my left here, is an assistant professor of cultural anthropology at Purdue University. Drawing on black feminism and post-colonial feminist science and technology studies, she explores the knowledge production of women of the African diaspora. Her work provides crucial insights into how the politics of race and gender in computing and engineering cultures intersect with place, simultaneously challenging and enabling the endurance of racialized, gendered, and colonial divisions of labor. Shobita Parthasarathy is a professor of public policy at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on the international politics and policy related to science and technology. Her most recent book, Patent Politics, Life Forms, Markets, and the Public Interest in the United States and Europe, has not only provided crucial insights into the role science and technology play in the shifts in governance and marketization of life, but also has notably influenced the 2013 US Supreme Court case challenging the patentability of human genes. Monroe Price, last but not least, is the founder and former director of the Center for Global Communication Studies at the Annenberg School, University of Pennsylvania, and he is also the Joseph Sadie Danziger Professor of Law. Under his direction, the Center of Global Communication Studies worked with a wide transnational network of regulators, scholars, and practitioners in Europe, Africa, Latin America, and Asia, as well as in the United States. Professor Price has founded numerous other groundbreaking initiatives, including but not limited to the program in comparative media law and policy at Oxford University, which has shaped many generations of interdisciplinary scholars working on media and tech policy in a range of international settings. So, we have asked our panelists each to prepare a 5-minute opening statement in whatever format they like in response to our panel's provocation. And we'll then begin after the opening statements to take questions from the audience in attendance here and remotely. So I ask you now to please join me in welcoming our panelists. And I heard that this panel has a preference of going in order, but I'm not sure where to start. André, do you want to kick us off when we go?
Not it. I talk enough as
yes. Great.
Hello. Hi. Thank you. Thank you, Silvia, for such a wonderful introduction as well. I'm so happy to be here. I want to sort of begin with thinking about my work and my positionality in my work. And so I spend much of my time working with young African-American, Ghanaian, Nigerian women who want to fix the world, right? They want to, and they think technology will help them do it. Within our communities, in our classrooms, in our workshops, they're excited about the future, they're excited about the potential of technology, and then they leave. They leave into communities or learning environments that do not feel that they belong, that tell them that they don't belong, or that tells them that their contributions do not matter in thinking about the future. And so it's very important for us to think about, when we're talking about the culture of tech, thinking about the ways it's entangled with histories of exclusion, histories of racism, histories of sexism, and how that negatively impacts the way some of us get to see the world. And so I wanted to talk a bit about some of the questions that I've been thinking a lot about over the past few years. I did not mention that when I say young women and girls, I see myself, right? Because I was also one of these young women at some point before I moved to the left to anthropology. But I do much so see myself in the work that they're doing and connect deeply with them. So one of the things that becomes central to our conversations now is how do we navigate and negotiate these ideas of that stereotype, the types of work and contributions that they can have, but also thinking about the ways to contest their role within technology as well. And so a part of their learning experience now becomes learning difference and learning how to play with a structure that might not be so nice to them as well. And so thinking a lot about moving forward requires us to think about the different entanglements of technology within these larger sort of systems, and also dealing with the overrepresentation of white males within these communities, and also ways to think about making space for all of us to think and imagine. And so one of the questions that I begin with is, what does it mean for us, for me as a Black feminist, for those of us living in what Christina Sharp notes as the wake of multiple systems and histories of oppression? How do we think about the future? What does it mean for us to think about the future? What kinds of pedagogies and practices are needed to support young people in imagining a more just and equitable future for themselves, not just for fixing it for the rest of us? And not just in service of diversity agendas or to calm fears about workforce competitiveness, but a truly anti-colonial and feminist future. How do our everyday engagements with power complicate how we cultivate educational experiences moving forward?
Thank you.
Hear me? No. Yes? Really close? Closer? Is that better? Yes. Okay. So I approach this question of tech culture through my work with communities in constrained contexts and the lived conceptualizations of tech culture. For example, as Silvia mentioned, one of my field sites is Havana, Cuba. And people here don't consider tech culture to have been born out of Silicon Valley, but to be a distinct local tech culture that is their primary tech culture and is an alternative to this normative Western version of tech culture. And Cuba, if you've seen recent news about Cuba, especially over the past 5 years, it's often framed as an isolated country. And this is primarily due to the fact that the large majority of people don't have access to the World Wide Web. But instead, people have created their own versions of the internet. And so these people describe themselves as natural inventors. They speak about their culture as one of unique innovations and natural technological skill. And this is all the while contending with these large amounts of work that people have to do on a daily basis to both build and sustain overlapping internets. that are not disembodied, they're not invisible, and they are not part of these larger or directly connected to global structures. And I feel like people, the previous panel have hinted that there's Western discourses around technology and innovation are located within capitalist notions of linear progress, especially preoccupied with the speculative extraction of future economic value. In contrast, the work required to engage and sustain technological practices, specifically among communities that are at the margins, is locally situated within worlds of shifting tensions, where regular breakdowns and disconnection, not progress, are considered the norm. Additionally, I think it's important to point out that at the same time, there's a lot of work that's required to sustain these socio-technical systems. These engagements are grounded in leisure-based activities. So these are also sites of pleasure, and not necessarily sites that where people are preoccupied with this progress or economic advancement. And they're also not inherently sites of resistance. People don't describe it in that way. So I think what I'm getting at is that I want to push us to think about what we mean when we say tech culture and whose culture we are talking about, and for whom is the culture that supposedly comes after unimaginable for. And I think that the Western perspective of tech culture is a privileged one. And so even as we critique or maybe try to reject these narratives, we simultaneously reinforce this dominant view of tech culture. And it's this type of rhetoric and thinking that continues to frame policy, research, funding decisions, and technological design. So I think the fact that this supposed future may appear to be unimaginable is because there's a tendency to think through this issue from a particular perspective, and whether we're critiquing it, praising it, or trying to find some type of nuanced balance between the two. While forgetting that nearly half of the world's population doesn't have access to the World Wide Web. And so tech culture means something different. So I think looking beyond this perspective requires us to take an approach that is locally situated in various realities and alternate tech cultures where stasis and maintenance, not Western ideas of progress or human development, or technology as a natural site of resistance. So I'm wrapping up, but I think that in the context of capitalist progress, it is difficult, obviously, to step outside of this, especially for those who are deeply embedded within it. So insights from communities that have varying perceptions of tech cultures, I think they can help us to situate ourselves as outliers within a larger cultural space. And this might be a way for us to envision potentially new possibilities, as well as new questions that we should be asking ourselves.
Great, thank you. So I just want to take a brief moment to reflect on what the two of us have been telling us so far before we hand it over to Monroe. So I think what both of us are calling, what both of you are calling upon us to do is to sort of reflect on our own complicity in seeing ourselves and our cultural environments as a norm. And by our, I mean here a kind of research community that's embedded in partially in the tech industry, that's doing research in the tech space. And I really enjoyed both of you challenging us to think about other imaginaries and alternative ways of phrasing technology that takes us beyond the binary of either co-option, subsumption by the capitalist market, or resistance on the other hand. It seems both of you in your field work have been seeing have worked with people who experience technology in very different ways that don't necessarily fit into that binary. And I think that's a really interesting path for us to explore maybe in the Q&A. So thank you both. Monroe, is your mic working?
My mic is not working.
It's working.
Are you sure? Really? Okay, all right, I'll assume. So I'll embrace it. Okay.
Even closer. Okay.
So I want to introduce a more apocalyptic tone to this. So what's been missing has been the really pessimistic view of the human race, climate change, the impact of technological change on individuality, etc. And I was inspired by this idea after tech culture to think about the apocalyptic in some way, because the imagination depends so much on the existence of individual autonomy. I was checking on the film festival that the center should have, which might include Stepford Wives and Soylent Green and at any rate, so there's an apocalyptic strain in American thinking, and I think ultimately some of that should rub off on the way in which the center thinks about alternative futures. Short of the apocalyptic are the alternative global imaginaries of the internet. What's the Russian internet, or the Russian influence on internet policy, or the Chinese influence on internet policy? These are these are different imaginaries than were discussed even in the last panel. And the question is, how do they affect change, etc.? So I would say what's happening to humanity is more central to this discussion than the other thing that I wanted to discuss a little bit was what I call the aesthetics of intervention. One of the aspects of this center, the idea that it should be in certain cases, etc. And I don't think we have a full understanding of what I'm calling the aesthetics of intervention, which is how are the moments, how does a particular institution like the center gain ownership of a kind of agenda for intervention, style of intervention, and a justification for intervention. Some of this has to do with the function of being at a university, but some of it just has a function of a kind of righteousness about what a appointed group thinks are the proper grounds, which they should, for intervention. But I think of it this way: in global context, it's often been my experience that the left creates appropriate tools and the right exploits them. And the question is can that be true here, which is mechanisms, justifications, designs, etc., which are honed and developed for very good reasons, but that then are co-opted or seized by, I'm not sure what you do about that, but it's an interesting. Last thing I want to say in this segment is might be called the political organization of centers like that have this issue of intervention, and what aspects of organization make them effective. I'm not sure whether you're going to question of founding visions, for example. How do they influence the effectiveness of organizations like the Center Society for Society? And so it seems to me the agenda that I'd like to set forth for this panel part is humanity, global alternatives, organization alternatives that affect the power of the organization to achieve its goal.
Nothing too small. Great. So as Silvia said, my expertise is in politics and policy related to emerging technologies across countries. I've done research in the US, Europe, and now India. And my comments today are largely informed by my time doing research and analyzing, but also in the trenches in terms of debates in genetics, biotechnology, and intellectual property. And I'll make this point a couple of times today, but I want to urge us, I know that we're talking about tech culture. The assumption in this room is that tech culture, we're talking about digital tech. And of course, that makes sense, that we're talking about a center with computing in the name. But I think that there are lessons to be learned from other tech cultures and other tech experiences. The biotech experience in particular is one that I think there's quite a bit to learn from. There's also some ways in which the experiences are quite different. But I think there are actually some key important lessons, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But today I want to make 2 quick points about what I think could be imagined by the name escape. And the ways in which the name itself allows us to imagine a different kind of culture after tech culture. And those 2 points, the first focuses on ethics, and the second focuses on interdisciplinarity. So escape, as you can see in the symbol that Christian has gotten the rights for, we hear, is of course a clever name for the new Center for Ethics, Society, and Computing. It reminds us of the escape key on the keyboard that allows us to interrupt a program and as the mission statement says, to critically examine essentially what's going on. But there's more than cleverness, I think, in the name. The placement of ethics and society before computing allows us to have another reminder and possibility. And that is to think first about the kind of world we want to create, and to remember that technology, in this case computing, is simply a tool to achieve the kind of world we want to create. So usually in conversations about emerging technologies, we tend to assume innovation and ask how we can innovate. And then we're making tweaks around the edges to kind of make the technology ethical. Rather than asking, should we innovate, how should we innovate, or should we be innovating at all? I suggest that I like the name escape, and the name escape suggests that we should start perhaps by asking citizens about the futures that they imagine, and then the role that tech might play. But as we do this, we have to take seriously the question of we, and that of course has come up already a couple times on this panel. Too frequently, those of us involved in discussions about the development and governance of emerging technologies talk about the public good as though it were singular and self-evident. In fact, some of the questions on the last panel also talked about sort of this idea of ethics being self-evident, and essentially the assumption is that it's a utilitarian approach, right? And I come from a policy school where we teach a lot of students about cost-benefit analysis, so that is the definition of ethics that resonates quite well, which is the idea that if something is good for the greatest number of people, then it is therefore the public good or ethical. But of course, we also know that too often the negative consequences of technology are often borne by communities that are particularly marginalized, and that the benefits of technologies are reaped by those who already have socioeconomic, racial, and gender privilege. The good news is that over the last few decades, scholars have begun to develop sophisticated ways of understanding the needs and priorities of citizens, from analyzing grassroots activism to conducting deliberative democratic engagement activities. My hope for Escape is that we can build on this work, and instead of starting with the question, how can we build ethical tech or tech for public good, that we start by asking questions about the futures that citizens want, how different citizens might want different futures, and how they might understand the public interest differently. How can we ensure that the views of traditionally marginalized communities are taken seriously and centrally, and then start to ask whether and how technology plays a role. But it's important to remember that there are also really serious and important power dynamics that are at play here. We tend to assume innovation and this, how can we do it, both because of the power of the private actors involved, but also because of the institutionalized power of technical disciplines in contrast to the humanities and social sciences, and the unquestioned way in which we treat interdisciplinarity as a value. If we look at the history of struggles over emerging technologies, from nuclear power to the current concerns over CRISPR, the gene editing technology, We see that scientists and technologists tend to shape the conversation, with humanists and social scientists running behind to flesh out the implications. And if you look more deeply, it becomes abundantly clear that the humanists and social scientists didn't choose the car, they didn't choose the driver, we didn't choose the route, nor did we choose the road. In the case of biotechnology, the scientists initially concerned about the technology in the 1970s and 1980s emphasized risk, and to a lesser degree, the morality of producing genetically engineered humans. This left a score of questions off the table that could fill up many, many talks I could give. But the one that I just want to mention for a second is that questions of political economy were entirely left off the table. Convenient, isn't it? It left off the table questions about whether biotech produced new forms of control, whether it concentrated this control in the hands of a few private actors, and whether that kind of control exacerbated existing inequalities. And of course, we see now, 50 years later, that those are central questions in how biotechnology has played out in society. But by some definition, the story of biotech is one of interdisciplinarity. There are lots of centers for biotechnology in society, and there is, of course, famously lots of bioethics programs, including at University of Michigan. But my hope is that ESCAPE can pioneer a new balanced approach that first requires real attention to the politics of knowledge production. With digital technologies, there seem to be many fruitful relationships evolving between the technical communities, humanists, and social scientists, but I also see tech leaders talking about how we need AI ethics, or we need to train more scientists and engineers in ethics, while denying a lot of the work that's being done because they see it as irrelevant, unfeasible, or too critical. And this, of course, when I hear that sort of stuff, my antennae go up, because those are, of course, exercises in power. So what does it require to create a truly feminist, justice-focused, inclusive, and interdisciplinary approach that ESCAPE seeks to do? We need to start, perhaps, with an unfamiliar and uncomfortable level of introspection, and then difficult discussions about the differences between fields in terms of our assumptions, values, incentive structures, work cultures, and practices. We need to take seriously the real power differentials between disciplines that often stem from differences in levels of funding. We also need to approach these efforts with extreme humility from all parties. After all, the whole point of an interdisciplinary approach is a realization that we can't see or understand an issue fully through the lens of only one discipline. It isn't easy, but I think it's worth it to serve public interests, plural, and I'm hopeful that ESCAPE can lead the way.
I don't know how to follow that. I can tell you that some of you missed a really dynamic lecture yesterday where I talked largely about what it is I do, so I want to offer something slightly different today. I have a couple of concerns and a couple of questions. So I find it fascinating that in order to kind of highlight the dynamism of this particular center, and I do think it's dynamic, that we use BuzzFeed-style headlines for the panel names. Sorry, I couldn't help myself, Christian. And what does that say about the types of things that we need in order to gain attention in this economy, particularly as a center that's interested in doing ethics in society and computing? To follow up on some of the things that Holly and Michaelanne said, I also am interested in what non-white cultures do when they are participating in internet spaces. In fact, one of the central theses of my book is that Black people are natural internet users, a claim which got me in quite some hot water because, you know, claims of essentialism is basically, I was saying the same as Black people are great basketball players or great twerkers, right? It didn't sit well. But I say that as an ecological approach, and I think this models what Shobita has said as well, that once you step outside the white Western technocultural framework, you begin to understand that different people bring themselves. They are always already interpolating themselves with the technologies that they use. And I think that's something critical to understand from an equity perspective, a fairness perspective for what this center is hoping to do. But I also think it's necessary for a moment of reflexivity, right? And I think one of the things, the concern that this center must address is, what does whiteness and modernity bring to these particular topics, right? And so I asked this question in part because my primary concern and my gratefulness for being invited here is I wanted to ask this question to the audience as well as to the people on the board with me. What kind of accountability structures exist to control whiteness and masculinity, given the deprecation of Black Lives Matter or the impotence of Me Too and cancel culture, right? If these visibly visceral movements in online media, which garnered millions of views and lots of media attention, have failed to hold structures that are in some ways imbricated with technology in many different ways, if they fail to hold them accountable, what is it that we can hope to do from this institutional purge, right? The last thing I'll say, and this is more personal for me, I've been getting interviewed more often recently for some strange reason, apparently book something other, right? And one of the questions I get asked by journalists, and this is directly pertains to the title of this panel, is what's next for Black people when Twitter goes away, right? So people are, I don't understand what the fascination is that Black people will have nothing really to do once our primary medium of communication no longer exists. And so the question always bemuses me. And I go back to the line that I wrote, and I think it's important for something that we're talking about here as well. I wrote this in 2012 when I was talking about Twitter, and I said, once the visibility of the hashtag dies down and Twitter deprecates trending topics, Black Twitter will still be sailing along because it always has been and will continue to be a place where we find ourselves and bring joy to our everyday existence by having moments where we can talk to people who understand our place and our position, right? And so I wanted to end there because I think it's important that we talk about for the Escape Center, the mundane. Not just infrastructures, as Dana and Julia really worked over quite well in the previous panel, right? But what does it mean to bring ethical concerns to the mundane lives of people who are not necessarily able to practice a boutique individualism, a boutique divestment from the technologies that they happen to use in their lives? So Julia brought up the idea of the Google image search, right? And I have a similar story about something that happened over a decade ago now, when Google used to serve up some really interesting results for Black girls, right? And that's not an individual decision. It obviously was an algorithmic decision because as long as I'm signed into my Google account from a computer with a recognized IP address that Google has, they will no longer serve me those egregious search results. I have to go away, right? I can't use my phone. I have to use someone else's computer, right? But if I use someone else's computer, those results come up again, right? This is I mean, is there more mundane search than Black girls? Right? What can we do to address those instances of Google image search serving up images of gorillas for Black people, or Google search results? They no longer do autocomplete in the same way, but serving up the zeitgeist, right, of how people think about each other using technological means. How can the ESC Center address that and its cultural aspirations? Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm now going to switch over our screens to our question tool. And I think that first question we see there actually was edited as, it was actually meant to ask, when are we actually going to talk about culture of the tech culture? So let me sort of annotate that question, and I also invite people to, join in on actually adding more questions to the web. So one of the things that I heard our panelists say was, on the one hand, an attention to sites and practices that often are, on the one hand, not considered the core, the quintessential example of tech innovation. What might happen typically at the periphery or outside of Silicon Valley, no matter if that is in other regions or in other cultural sites of appropriation, sites of consumption, regions that aren't really celebrated as inherently innovative like Silicon Valley might be. So I think we heard quite a bit actually about there are already cultures after a particular kind of tech culture, the more dominant view on tech culture, the promises that we are being told by Silicon Valley. So they are here, But the challenges that I also hear you all talk about is how do we connect the stories, the insights that you are gathering through your research in various places that aren't necessarily in these dominant sites of tech innovation. How do we connect those sites and experiences to challenges that seem to be happening or that are that we are facing on a much larger scale? So André was talking about the importance to focus on mundane practices. Shobita was talking about lesson learned from tech cultures and experiences that happened, that continuously happened and happened in the past in other sites of tech production, right? To look to other sites. Monroe encouraged us to think about what is the, could we conceive of something that is simply just the Russian internet or the Chinese internet? So my question, I guess, to you, building on the sort of provocation of can we actually then talk about culture of the tech culture? What are the challenges in connecting these existing practices that do challenge a dominant view of what counts as innovation, what counts as the dominant approach to technology? How do we connect them to these questions about systemic change, about issues that we face on a global level?
One point I omitted, thinking pessimistically, as I did before, is the fascination with internet shutdowns. Look at Kashmir, look at the Cameroons, etc. A kind of realization that there's a kind of fragile notion of the internet dominance, etc. So, and there are tremendous cultural implications here, and partly it's the state worrying about control, the state worrying about sovereignty, the state worrying about its capacity to control the narrative. So I think something that doesn't often it comes up frequently, but not in this discussion today, is this idea of shutdowns or other dramatic events that alter the course of the way we think about the internet.
Actions. There were a couple of other questions. One of them, I think, is building on what we just talked about a little bit. And I'm going to, both read the question and then maybe open it up towards our other panelists. Can we hear a little bit more about... can we hear a little bit more about Black girls changing the world? And so I wanted to invite all the panelists to maybe talk a little bit about concrete examples that you've seen in your various projects, examples of people already envisioning an alternative, even though it might not be celebrated as such, even though they themselves might not see it, as part of a resistance movement or anything like that, or it might not be read as such. Any sort of examples that you could give the audience, sort of building on that question here?
I'll go ahead and start it off. I did my field work at Spelman College, if anyone is familiar, in Atlanta, Georgia, one of two surviving Black women's colleges in the U.S., historically Black women's colleges. Spelman, for the last 25 years, has been the leading undergraduate institution for African Americans who complete PhDs in STEM disciplines, the second most, actually. They've been over by another HBCU. But anyways, the point is that for the last over 2 decades, they have had a Spelman model of improvement that works, that begins with an approach that is rooted in serving the actual needs and lives of the women. It begins with ethics. It begins with social justice. Yet, if I talk about Spelman in many places, most people don't know about it. And a lot of the women talk about the reluctancy or the unwillingness for other institutions to see them as a site for knowledge production and as a leader in how other institutions can also be more inclusive. And so it's an interesting dynamic, and I use the word interesting purposefully, and at a time where we're looking at how educational institutions can be more responsive, we refuse to see what Black girls and Black women have been doing for a very, very long time. Like service learning, for example, is now the hot thing in STEM education. Spelman, liberal arts education, over 2-3 decades they've been doing this. And still to this day, they have issues with sustained funding. They have issues with retention as far as faculty. They have issues with even being considered in these larger discourses, and how can we make ethics the center of computing and technology education. So that's just one of the different ways that we're seeing these lines reconceptualized. Even when the rhetoric says we want diversity, inclusion, and ethical education, we are just unwilling to recognize it already going on.
So I already touched a little bit on a few examples from Havana, but I'll say more specifically. So one of the things I've looked at is these I call them overlapping internets, but the way that bits of access to the World Wide Web interact with these socio-technical systems that people in Havana have built. So one of them is called Streetnet or SNet, and it's technically an intranet or a community network that has tens of thousands of users, and they've designed their own websites. It's primarily a gaming platform, but it's evolved to include dating sites, forums, classifieds, and it's primarily hardwired, so connected through Ethernet cables across the city. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that this is they call it an innovation, and they're incredibly proud of it. And at the same time, they regularly point out that they don't have the choice to be able to choose this as an alternative to access to the World Wide Web. So at the same time as it's kind of positioned as this innovative site, again, this idea of resistance, a lot of the people that I speak with are saying, yeah, we want to be able to play games and chat with our friends like we assume that everybody else in the world is able to do, and yet we can't. This is what we have to do, and they're also proud of it. So I think it's not really that I'm getting to a specific point here, but the main thing is that it's again against this binary of, oh, there's this alternative to this, or there's an innovation here, or look at what people are doing, it's so cool. It's complicated. It's a site of amazing things that people have built on their own, and it's also a reminder that they feel excluded.
Yeah, so Silvia, I really appreciate your reframing the sort of culture after tech culture in terms of maybe culture outside of tech culture, or, you know, sort of what's happening outside of tech culture, which may have been a typo, but I actually take from that some inspiration. I think, so my current research is on the politics of inclusive innovation in India, and India is a particularly interesting place because you really do see this attempt to globalize Western innovation ideology in all sorts of places, including into the most mundane technologies, which are the ones that I'm actually studying. And one of those mundane technologies that I'm studying is sanitary pads, and the idea that apparently now sanitary pads can save all girls and women. And if you didn't know, now you know, as they say. What's interesting about this is, I think that on the one hand, you have I don't think you see, interestingly, I mean, I've always been interested in resistance to tech culture, and in my previous work, I've studied a lot of that. But here you don't actually see resistance. You don't, the girls and women who are being offered these sanitary pads or convinced in various ways to use especially disposable sanitary pads are not necessarily in a position of resistance, but they are in a position to reinterpret sometimes, or in a position to reject. And they, so you see examples, for example, where they use disposable sanitary pads for other things. But what I also think is interesting in this process is actually the reinterpretation that perhaps those girls and women can do, but also scholars can do, I realized that there is a real politics to classifying something as a technology, as an innovation, or as part of tech culture. And so a couple of the things that I think are really interesting that I've discovered in my fieldwork is that, for example, there are these men who are valorized by getting, at the World Economic Forum, by Bill Gates, et cetera, who have produced and create disposable sanitary pad markets. They patent the pads as well as the machinery. It all looks like the perfect expansion of Western innovation. But then you have these women who are developing, they say, no, the problem isn't actually the material object, it's the distribution system. Women don't want to buy pads from men. And so they innovate a distribution system, but they don't call it innovation. They don't actually think what they do is innovative or innovation because it doesn't fit within the categories that they're taught are part of tech culture. So then as a scholar, as an analyst, part of my job is perhaps to reclassify their work as being actually technological work. In addition, you also see in the Indian context, right? So the idea for a lot of, especially rural Indian women, that one needs disposable sanitary pads is problematic for a variety of reasons. So for example, if you imagine a woman who's working in the fields all day, changing disposable sanitary pads multiple times a day seems strange, right? So women, for example, bleed into the petticoats underneath their saris, right? And they reject this idea that they need these disposable sanitary pads, or that they're not necessarily able to do that. But again, those kinds of practices that are seen as backwards and also not seen as innovative, not involving any kind of knowledge, are the kinds of practices that I think we as scholars can start to recast as being actually valid, viable, and innovative. And I think that those are the kinds of political moves that we can make to reframe this conversation about what culture and what technology outside of tech culture can potentially look like.
So this is an interesting question that you posed, Silvia. So I want to address it in a couple of different ways. And my work really does center around technoculture, the culture and politics that people assign, and beliefs that people assign to technology as we navigate them in our everyday practice, right? And so one of the ways to understand the contributions of Black women and girls on the web is to understand the types of responses that they get when they do so. And so I'm specifically thinking here of Mikki Kendall. Shout out to Mikki. Her book is coming out on February 25th, Hood Feminism. Get that after you buy my book. Which also comes out on the 25th. But Mikki is notable in part because of her work behind the hashtag Solidarity is for White Women, right? And if you did a search for that hashtag, some of the results you would get from Google are feminism's toxic Twitter wars, Mikki Kendall and her online beefs with white feminists, and the incomplete guide to feminist infighting, right? So the efforts of Black women online are often viewed through a prism of, again, back to my earlier comment, whiteness and modernity. The fact that Black bodies should be civilized when they're addressing problems, and if those problems are specifically pertaining to actions of white people, they need to be even more civilized, despite the platform, right? And so I find that particular understanding Black contributions to the web interesting, because you need to understand resistance actually is the right word, the resistance they face when they deem to share their opinions online. My second example would be something that's gotten a lot of attention these days, which is cancel culture. And I talk about cancel culture from a slightly different perspective in my book. I talk about it as call-out culture, which I argue stems from already existing practices by Black women, Black people in general, but specifically online, Black women and Black queer folk, of showing the receipts, right? And call-out culture involves highlighting or submitting digitized evidence, whether it's a screenshot, whether it's a video, whether it's an old tweet, right, to situate past transgressive behavior in the now, right? And it's more often done by Black people against Black people because we police our own, but it's often done, and Me Too was a really good example of this, as was Black Lives Matter, right? Are spaces where we will illuminate things such as the terrible police record of Mayo Pete. by showing the things that he said before or highlighting before as a way of showing that there is a reason to provide substantive empirical critique of ongoing or previously unconsidered social injustice, right? But when black people do it specifically, call-out culture becomes Twitter's mob mentality. And this is complicated, right? Because Twitter is already seen as an unproductive waste of time kind of space. Like, what is the point of Twitter? I dare you to answer, right? Everybody in here will have a different answer, right? But for some reason, when brown folk and black folk use it, because I could mention this for Arab Spring as well, right? Unless it's something that certain people can identify as appropriate activity, then the rest of it is considered either an affront, right? So the loudness of black women's voices in critiquing figures like Weinstein. I don't know if you remember when people discussed Aurora Perrineau and how quickly her case against Weinstein was dismissed while other people's problems with Weinstein were elevated, right? But when black women and other folk do this, their voices are deemed as uncivil and inappropriate. So I don't know if we can ever talk about post-tech culture unless we're willing to talk about the cauldron in which these behaviors emerge in response to certain practices, or the matrix in which they're embedded. So shout out here again to Lisa Nakamura and her concept of glitch racism, where racism online is not a glitch, it's a feature. Right? And you must address that particular feature if you're talking about moving to another element of technology, particularly internet technologies, where we'll move to a utopian, more civil space. I don't see it, but it's possible, right? It's possible.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to take Shobita's provocation that I think summarizes some of the other comments as well, to shift our frameworks and narratives of innovation and to think about the tools we might already have available to do so, to our next question that I think reflects some of this as well. So there's two big trending questions. One of them revolves around this notion of what is maybe existing scholarship and language in place available to us that we can use to challenge Western dominance in tech culture and how it's being defined. The particular example here is post-colonial scholarship. I would also add critical race and feminist scholarship, provide some of the tools available to us, and I think all of our panelists actually indirectly invoked some of this work to then come, tie this to the other big trending question of how we can move beyond sort of a culture of nerdy white guys that are sort of defining what technology is all about. So if we could hear from the panelists a little bit more about what are some of their methodological and analytical toolkits that they have used, be that post-colonial scholarship, feminist, critical race, other toolkits outside of those that I just named, that you have found helpful in challenging maybe the white bro culture in technology, and I would say not just in technology, but in many other disciplines. What do you draw from, and what works for you in that space?
I'll give a plug for a tool that we use at Oxford called the Media Moot Court Global Competition, which penetrates as regional rounds in Beijing and Delhi and Cairo, et cetera, and it's designed specifically to take contexts in which people can be empowered. They can be empowered by improving their capacity to argue, et cetera. And that's a method, not a research method, but a method to empower. The other question, which is slightly indirect, relates to one of my first encounters with Christian, in which we had a conference on ethnographies of the internet. And in a certain sense, it was developing stories. This is a reflection on several of these questions, which is, can we have stories? Can we have positive stories? Can we have negative stories? What's the warehouse of anecdotes that can be make a persuasive case? I think there's probably strengths in this, but there are also tremendous weaknesses in kind of like the Iceman cometh. What have you done to the where are the stories of success? Where are the stories or the stories of failure, depending on the narrative that you want to indicate?
So I may have written a methodological paper on analyzing the internet and social media. I may have. And this is in response to some of the questions I'm seeing as well. It's a complicated name. It's critical technocultural discourse analysis. It's a discourse analytic approach using a conceptual framework. I'll go back to that. But a discourse analytical approach to examining both interfaces that people encounter in either online or in everyday spaces, and the ways people understand themselves through those discourses, right? So you're looking at both the interface as a close theory, close reading discourse analysis, and what the things that people say through critical discourse analysis, which looks at power and discrimination and the ways people understand themselves. And these are tied together by a framework that requires cultural theory and history and philosophy of technology and science and technology studies. It's just as complicated as it sounds, right? The reason why I say critical theory, critical cultural theory, is that when I came up with the technique, I was aware that there were already modes of examining internet use. Susan Herring's critical computer-mediated discourse analysis, which pays specific attention to the interface, which I think is something that's often missing from research. People assume that discourses happen and the interface is a neutral actor in those particular things, and I've always felt that you have to examine what the interface does to mediate those conversations. But I also come from social informatics, and my argument that culture also mediates both the reaction to the interface and the discourses people produce. So I incorporated critical cultural theory in this particular technique, but I left it open because while my interest is critical race theory, and I use that often, I have seen CTDA approaches that use black feminist theory, queer theory, or one of my favorite students came up with something she calls queer theory using E. Patrick Johnson's work, right? And I left it open so that you could be specific in applying the philosophical perspective of the group that you have under examination to their technology use. Right? And in this, I was inspired by W.E.B. Du Bois, who said, lions don't have historians, right? Which is a kind of opaque phrase, but I'll let you sit with it, right? But the idea that when evaluating people's technology use, we often default as researchers to a white modernist frame. We look at the political economy. Is it productive? Is it effective? Hi, HCI, I'm talking to you, right? And I thought that we could do something different. We could look at how people already have their understanding of the world and then apply that to their technology use. And in this, I'm inspired by Daniel Miller and Don Slater's Internet, the Ethnographic Approach. What I ended up with, as I've worked through this over the last decade, is I employ a libidinal economic approach to understanding technology use, right? And no, this is not Deleuze and Guattari. Don't ask me about that in the questions or in the Q&A. This is more Francois Lyotard and his concept of jouissance, which is roughly translated as an excess of life, right? If you want to talk about an excess of life with regard to the libidinal economy of information technology, their excess of life is strictly directed towards instrumental and pragmatic deployments of technology, right? Is the code beautiful, right? How are we satisfying stakeholders, largely VCs, but we'll talk about that in another moment, right? But those are libidinal approaches, right? It's not the sharply defined legalistic, rationalistic objective approach that we want to think. There are always going to be libidinal tensions behind that. For me, looking at black culture and my joy in being black, despite the problems that it brings me in a multitude of environments, I wanted to talk about the libidinal approach of blackness, the libidinal economic approach of blackness to looking at information technologies. And one of the first things I applied this approach to was Black Twitter. Right? Black Twitter confounds many people. There have been technologists who have attempted to apply translation algorithms to black discourse on Twitter, and they still can't get it because it doesn't fit certain recognized rules of discourse, right? And part of that is because we developed a certain type of talking called signifying, right, that was intended to be coded discourse. We were able to talk I'm sorry, I was going to say shit on the microphone, and then I realized I shouldn't say that. Oops. Right. And we developed this method of talking in front of people who would ordinarily discipline us for having the nerve to have a voice. We came up with ways to talk around them, right? And this is evidenced in Black Twitter discourse. If you ever follow some of the more outrageous Black Twitter hashtags, you'll know that they don't always make sense upon first encounter, but then they also continue to develop and move and spread rhizomatically, if you want to go back to Deleuze and Guattari. Not necessarily a chain of signifiers, right? But they tend to develop and expand in many interesting ways. And I'll close by saying the most interesting example of this for me, there was an incident with Yahoo Business that happened a few years ago where black people were critiquing the mode that Trump would use to get funds for his military expenditures. There was another moment when we made the call, I think not we, because I ain't do it, right? But when Trump made the call, I think it was, and the tweets started flying World War III. Did y'all see the World War III tweets? Now, I will say, depending on what your circles are, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, you'll see different ones. But the black ones followed a similar mode to they did when they responded to the tweets from a couple of years ago, right? Lots of jokes about black cultural commonplaces. My favorite, and I will not explain it to you, but I will tell you that it is my favorite, right, is Trump says we're about to head to World War III, and the black soldier says, well, who all gonna be there, right? Don't worry about it if you don't get it. Ask your black friend, they'll tell you later, right? But it's an interesting way of inserting both black cultural commonplaces, black wariness about being put in social situations at the command of somebody who doesn't have their best interests at heart, right? But also a really innovative use of the medium. Right? If you told me Twitter was a news organization, I was like, well, who is this news to? If you told me Twitter was a medium for distributing TikTok memes, well, that I'd have to kind of agree with you. But overall, right, this is a culturally centered approach, using the cultural philosophy of that particular user group to understand their practice. And I think that kind of sort of answers that particular question in the way that you can take a look at it. Sorry, that was a really long answer. After that?
It is hard to follow that now. But I just want to say a couple of things on this point. So the first, which is just a method, you started with the methodological question. And for me, from a methodological perspective, I've sort of taken two approaches to how to kind of think about critique in the field. And the first is an easy and common one, which is to study activists and to really take seriously not only what they're arguing, but trying to understand their worldviews, their understandings, and their and as I suggested earlier, their imaginaries for the future. But the other, which is probably what I'm more known for, is that I and is more relevant now because a lot of the people that I'm studying now and working with now don't necessarily have the privilege to be an activist. Is that I do comparative work, and I approach comparative work as an interpretivist. And what that means is that when I do that comparative work, I don't take the categories for granted. So I'm constantly working between the two sites, whether between countries or between technologies, to force one site to force me to ask questions about the other site. And that allows me to question assumptions and worldviews and bring in, I think, a more deeply critical lens from a methodological perspective. But I also wanted to answer your question, Silvia, in sort of also what I saw coming up on the Q&A, which was this idea that post-colonial scholarship and critical race scholarship is well established in certain arenas, and yet it keeps getting, each new debate, it has to get reinvented and discussed. And my approach to this problem has been, I guess I'm in a position of odd, but also I increasingly realize privileged and unique and wonderful position, which is as an STS scholar in a school of public policy. There aren't many of us. I think that actually if there were more of us, we might help solve this problem. But not only am I an STS scholar in a school of public policy, but I run a science, technology, and public policy program. A lot of my students are scientists, engineers, and policy students. Some of them are in the audience. And they're graduate students. And that means that I have the opportunity, a really unique opportunity, to bring these ideas to students that are primarily working in tech, that are building these machines and thinking about, concerned about these questions. This is an opt-in program, so they're thinking about these questions, but they don't necessarily have the tools. They may have broadly heard about ethics, or they might have broadly heard about things like algorithmic bias, but they don't necessarily know that there are systematic ways of thinking about this. And my challenge, which I've realized over time been a fruitful one, is to figure out how to actually translate the more dense theoretical work that comes from the humanities and social sciences to those students. And you can ask them how successful I am at that, but that to me is a real opportunity to really ensure that the students who are ending up, the leaders and the best scientists and engineers that get produced from this institution are getting, whether they realize it or not, a little bit of that of those perspectives. And I know I'm not alone. I mean, Christian and Silvia, you guys are doing that too. I'm sure many of you guys on this panel are engaged in that kind of work as well. And I sometimes we forget that we're engaged in those kinds of important teaching opportunities, but I think we're sort of doing it all the time. I wish there were more of us, and I think that that's something that perhaps we can all fight for together, but that's an important way.
I think this might bring us actually to two questions that are receiving a lot of attention online. The first one being, as people working in this space, what are ways of addressing how tech companies, and I would say this really goes back beyond tech companies, have increasingly co-opted or subsumed alternatives or resistance movements, narratives in technology. I would say the university is another place for a successful economization of narratives of social change, not just the tech industry, as we talked about in the previous panel. And there was also a question that is very related to this one, focusing on this question of the role of critique and how we could possibly move beyond a binary between co-optation and resistance, asking the panel to elaborate a little bit more on that. So we just talked quite a bit about analytical resources, methodological approaches that you all have found helpful in your own work to challenge some of these binaries, to think about ways of participating, ways of embedding yourselves in communities who practice actually a non-binary approach to co-optation and resistance. So I wonder if there's any of the panelists who want to talk a little bit more about this question of, on the one hand, powerful institutions appropriating some of these technologies and tools and methodologies, analytical tools, that we use and deploy, that they are quite, in some ways accepted now in structures of power, and what that might mean for our understanding of what the role of the scholar is, or the role of the activist, given that techniques of resistance or scholarly intervention have found a way into certain structures of power as well.
It's not. Go ahead, Monroe.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I'm not sure I can answer this. I want to answer the question. I think I'm interested in this kind of premise of the capacity for failure. And I frankly am not. Maybe I've been co-opted. Undoubtedly, I've been co-opted and have co-opted. But I would say there's more room than I feel is being authorized here. That up to the individual scholar and questions of fear and quiet intimidation. So if I understand the premise of the question, and maybe I'm arguing with assumptions that it's making, and I think it's very important as the center launches to see itself as free of these kinds of constraints. And some of this is framing. I've noticed during the day, the framing assumes that this is a real problem, which may be an important thing to do, but the very framing of it that way has its capacity to self-limit and self-convince as to limitations. So rather than answer the question, I'd rather question the assumption.
I mean, one thing I was going to say from the trenches of the biology world, but even many other trenches. One of the challenges here is that the funding follows the tech and the perception of the tech problem. So there may, be, and I think somebody asked this in the Q&A, I mean, this is what happens. There's sort of a realization from the technical community, hey, we have a problem, we need some people to help us, and then university administration, funding bodies, et cetera, increase the funding. And so we end up as humanists and social scientists chasing after the funding and being then already playing a game where we didn't frame the terms of the debate. Bioethics is a wonderful and awful example, I think. But interestingly, in the bioethics case, I think they started out with some power, and then it diminished significantly over time, and the dynamics of bioethics changed significantly. But I think here too, this is a way. I mean, on the last panel, we were talking about what people like us in positions of relative privilege can do. I see myself in part as someone who has relative privilege because I don't rely on soft money, because I can choose my research agendas, and so I don't necessarily have to think about tech in the way that that is being framed for me. Because if you really think about it, yesterday it was nanotechnology, the day before it was stem cells, the day before that it was genetically modified organisms, somewhere in between, did I mention nanotechnology? There's cloning, right? So each one of those things, and today it's computing, tomorrow it will be something else. We don't necessarily want to be in that position of chasing the technology and also the politics of framing it, and I'm in a position where I have some privilege, but I think the other part of it is, as I suggested before, establishing both being clear-eyed about developing relationships with technical communities. I don't at all want to. I don't think that this is about sort of this isn't intentional on the part of the technical communities that we end up being the ones who are running after them. I think that that's just sort of more structural, but I think that there's a lot of potential. I have had and am developing collaborations with folks on the more technical side, where if you start out with really clear-eyed conversations about your differences, your assumptions, and what your goals are and how you might work together, I think that there are lots of potential possibilities. But you have to start with actually acknowledging that you're on a playing field that isn't level, and then trying to operate to try to level that playing field a little bit. But you also, at the same time, have to realize, I was talking to someone this morning who's a social scientist who is collaborating with a computer scientist. Now, she's in the UK, so she has to deal with all kinds of awful, the REF there and the sort of incentive structures. But it's very difficult, for example, for them to co-publish something to find a journal that will actually publish that work. So there are all kinds of structural issues, but there are small things, I think, that we can do, especially those of us who are less dependent on the funding, to try to build those kinds of relationships. And my hope for something like Escape is that once you start to normalize that way of engaging in interdisciplinary work, maybe that will become more the norm than something that people don't even think about.
Hello? I just wanted to sort of add on to that last point about the unevenness when we talk about so-called global technical systems, right? So trying to collaborate with folks who might not have the same privilege or position as a US passport might have, right? Considering that and how that shapes the sorts of questions we're able to ask and the data and methods that are validated for supporting or answering those questions. And those really, for me, I've just tried to be very attentive to it, despite not having all of the privileges that Western tech culture might afford similar scientists in my place. I do have some privileges, and just being cognizant of that in the field has been very, very important to me, and just offering an opportunity to uplift voices that many refuse to listen to. And so I come to the academy as not maybe a traditional academic. I don't say activist. I think that if you're a person connected to people who got you where you are forever indebted to those people. So you should always be working to improve the human condition. For me, the first question is, why is it that most are not, right? And thinking about what this escape might do to have us rethink these pseudo-binaries that we have, or binaries, or whatever we make these.
Got room for one more?
We have about 7 minutes, so I want to get on in 2 more questions. So a quick one.
Okay, I can make this. Unlike my previous answers, this will be short. One of the difficulties in evaluating technologies beyond a particular type of bias lies in the beliefs that we ascribe to technologies. For my work, I use this reading by Joel Dienerstein. It's not called the Western Technocultural Matrix, but that's one of the things he highlights in it. And by matrix, he's looking at the qualities. I call them libidinal, but he calls them qualities of belief that power Western technoculture, right? And they are progress, religion, modernity, whiteness, masculinity, and the future, right? How do you understand joy using those particular concepts, right? Those concepts are designed around an ideology of control, right? Of the spirit, of the world, of other people, right? So it's really difficult, because we are the fish that are swimming in the waters of Western technoculture, for us to start thinking of alternative ways. I appreciate the question because it highlights the problematic of trying to assess technologies from other means, but it's really difficult for us as academics to break free. At best, some of us manage by examining non-Western populations to highlight different ways of doing the computing, right? But sometimes we still fall in that same political economic trap, right? Is this resistance? How are we dealing with oppression? And even in the moments of joy, we still try to tie that joy to some sort of resistance to another structure, right? So I would ask the question of the audience, because we have a lot of dope academics in here, right? My friend and former student / colleague, Sriram Mohan, is in here, and he and my friend Aswin Punatambakar looked at something called a sound bridge, right, where people were using popular culture songs in India to promote cultural protests and political protests, right? They're taking a leisure artifact and repurposing it. But is it possible that they could have just really liked the song, right? How do you analyze that without making people seem like they're just doing dumb stuff all the time, right? So it's an ongoing difficulty when analyzing technologies.
Thank you. Faster, but not fast. So there is a question I think that is interesting for us because it came up for the previous panel as well in some other form, and the question is about there's often a stark divide in the conversations that are being had both within academia, in industry, and then there's very little bridging in between those two. So the question then is also interested in hearing from our panelists about how you are bridging those divides, how you are bridging from conversations in academia into industry, or from industry into academia, but also into the classroom, outside of the classroom, connecting with students and people who then maybe take jobs in the tech industry. So I would love to hear from our panelists how they have been working in that space, as most of us here on the panel are situated within academia, and our previous panel was very industry focused. So I think flipping it around a little bit.
I'm trying to understand how to place some controversy on this question. It's sort of like homogenized milk or pasteurized milk. Okay, so it could be. It seems the question is hard to render controversial. It's hard to. So problems are you trying to attack?
It's a question that came from the audience, so I could slightly rephrase it. I think, what are some of your strategies to bridge between divides that exist in terms of reach of the work that we do? Maybe what are the politics of that is a demand of scholarship? It's very seldom a demand of industry to reach into the academy, but it's often a demand placed on scholars to make the work relevant, to make it meaningful in a sort of industry context, to produce students who are able to find a job and sell their human capital on a market. Like, maybe there's a politics to that question, that demand placed on academics to make themselves relevant. So I would have phrased the question in that sense, but I also wanted to honor the high words this question got. So, but feel free to take it more into that direction, if that's more interesting, Monroe.
Hi, sorry. I asked the question, so I wanted to make sure I was being clear. So I think it's difficult sometimes as students for us to understand how academia and industry connect, because it seems that we're all, like in academia, we're learning one version of things, and then we get into industry and we're learning another version, right? Like, there's ethical issues that academics face as well as industry folks face. And so I'm wondering about the conversation in and out. So what happens as scholars, as far as like how you communicate with industry, or how you envision communication working maybe in the future, since that's the theme with industry, as far as like along ethical lines, like what that looks like, and maybe if you have any examples of issues you've encountered with your work getting out there, or vice versa, people coming to you from industry. That's kind of like what I was hoping to accomplish by asking that question.
Well, let me just say, I'll do a short. One thing I noticed at Annenberg, which is changing to some extent, was whether there was a culture that if you didn't go into the academy as a PhD student, you were a failure. You were close to a failure. That is to say, if you went to industry, this was good, did teach, etc. So I think that's changing, but it seemed to me also clear that very seldom were there lecturers and other people from the companies who came into the academy to supplement classes. I think there is now a greater effort to integrate to some extent and to see tech companies as suitable sites to develop one's personality.
So my mind went immediately to a specific issue that I've encountered, and that's really in speaking as a PhD student, the way that I was taught to speak to industry was in an implications for design section in my published papers, which I'm sure that everyone in industry read, and then tried to implement it into the platforms that they were working on. And obviously, this is not the case. And so really, instead of having a solution, I've thought about, like, it would be amazing if there was actually a pipeline that translates these ideas. Because I feel like in my research, I've had very concrete ideas that come directly from the field, and I think would be beneficial for a variety of communities. But like I don't know who to actually, at that time I didn't know who to talk to, and I also understand that from the industry side there's a lot of barriers. So this is more of, I think it would be very interesting and helpful to have a clearer communication channel, and not just in places where, we have the launch of a center and people come together, or at conferences where you're able to talk, but something that's more, I guess, tangible and ongoing, because I think that there are a lot of great ideas that are coming from the academy. And at the same time, if you're not working in industry as I am not, I also am not in there every day understanding why you may or may not be able to apply these lessons.
I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience right after I completed the PhD. So I worked in government and local government as an innovation researcher, which was frowned upon by some of my colleagues in anthropology. But one of the things that I faced was that I felt like I was trained to critique, but not trained to help solve their problem. And so a lot of folks I talked with, and I worked in the mayor's office, they've been working at these challenges for so long, and I had this idea that government didn't work because they didn't want it to work. And I was very pessimistic about it. I took the job because jobs are important. But looking back, I spent so much energy and time trying to get them to understand me, but not so much me building the competency to communicate outside of my discipline. And also with folks who, at the very core, wanted to help fix issues. So one of the things that helped, that I was able to do, is I developed an internship program to get undergraduate students to do like mini pilot research projects around maybe small issues that they had in the mayor's office. So maybe it was, for example, Cambodia Town Revitalization Project. Getting students out there to do some ethnography, talk to people, which is very rare that happens in local government. So just bringing that sort of insight that you can actually find answers if you talked and cared about residents' concerns, right? And so that's just one of the ways that I have been able to do it in the past. Moving forward, I'm just very cognizant of the language that I use. I'm very cognizant of teasing out the ideas that they might have around data and innovation, and also being conscientious of my own assumptions of how they're approaching these issues.
So I'll say, I mean, I guess I think about it as at a broad level, not just about academia and industry, but also decision makers generally, so policy folks, people in the nonprofit sector, et cetera. And the one thing that I often think about is that, there are the questions in my corner of the universe. There are the questions that policymakers ask, and then there are questions that policymakers should ask. And there are, part of the question is what business you're in. And I think to some degree I'm in both businesses, but I'm comfortable being in the second one because I also have enough experience to know now that sometimes the arc bends and the questions that they should be asking end up becoming the ones that they do ask. But on a more specific level, I think where this comes up is in discussions about technology for public good, or public interest technology, or tech for public good, or data for public, whatever version of those words. What I found is that we spend a whole lot of time and we have enormous investment in technical design and deployment and implementation, and yet that notion, the kind of other side, is totally goes without critique and is completely assumed, right? So I've spent a lot of my time in engagements with industry and policymakers, asking questions, for example, about, there are a whole bunch of assumptions embedded in the idea that the patent system is in the public interest, or that innovation is in the public interest, that genetic testing is in the public interest, or, whatever it is. What does the public interest mean? For whom? How? All of those questions. Just raising those questions is new, surprisingly, sadly, perhaps, but asking for the same level of specificity and analytic sophistication on that side of the equation is often where I start. There's some openness to that because people don't even realize that that's a thing. They, right? They kind of assume it. And I think that that's a place for us to play an important role. And I often find that in my engagements that's at least a good place to start. They may not agree with how we define, how I personally define public interest, but that's okay, so long as we understand that by its very definition, tech or data or tech policy is not in the public interest, for example.
Great, thank you so much. I'm afraid we are out of time. But I hope that you're all going to join us for a reception in a little bit. I'll just shorten my closing remarks that I prepared for today by actually just attempting to address one more question that got a lot of upvotes, and that I think is really important. It's this question of how we can ensure that groups who often are left out of these conversations, of these visions of the future, are included when we then think about the culture of the tech culture. And one of the things that has been, for me, a very personal project, and I will Christian started us with a very personal story, and I will end with a very personal story, has been that I've learned over the years to not shy away from talking explicitly about things that are uncomfortable and that people might not associate with techno-optimism or technological progress in the first place. And this includes talking openly about sexism, about racism, about various forms of exploitation, including how this involves us as researchers and scholars and how we've experienced some of these practices ourselves. And just to give you a personal anecdote in terms of how this played out for me, many years ago, I was doing research at an incubator in China. It was an incubator that funded and invested in startups that were doing smart Internet of Things type technology. It was an incubator that was funded not by the Chinese government, not by a Chinese tech corporation, but by a Silicon Valley investment firm. The incubator was run by white men exclusively. The mentors were exclusively white men. And aside from me as the ethnographer embedded in a startup who participated and got funded through the incubator, was only one other woman as an entrepreneur who joined the incubator program. And there were seemingly no other women. But the two women I ended up working a lot with were the two Chinese female staff workers who were hired to actually support the startups in turning their idea into a product. But what the women were most importantly doing, this was all unfolding in a time when people already began challenging the tech industries for its failed promises, where it wasn't all that sexy anymore to do a startup, where people began talking about how unsustainable entrepreneurship had become, how entrepreneurship had become a new form of labor exploitation. What these two women were hired to do was basically keeping that vision, that myth of promise and techno-happiness and techno-optimism alive. That's the work they did. That's the emotional labor they did. That's what helped the startups to be successful. And it was these two women in that incubator program who really helped me see that and talk about it more openly. This was a time when I was studying the promises of the maker movement that, was all about open sharing and people of all kinds. Everybody was supposedly empowered to participate, and that was not again happening. And so those two women really helped me. Those two Chinese women really helped me to not shy away from calling out the sexual harassment and sexism that they experienced, and that was normalized in terms of the labor exploitation. Okay, so that is my personal story in terms of what we can do to signal and show how the very work of innovation is still and continues to be on the shoulders of minorities. So it's not that people are not present, but they're often rendered invisible and are exploited. With that, I would also like to thank our fantastic panelists. Thank you so much for being here and making the time. And from my closing remarks, I actually want to move a little bit into our upcoming Escape events. we are very excited about some fantastic opportunities that are coming up for you all to engage with Escape. We are the co-sponsor of a Privacy at Michigan event that's coming up next week. There's going to be a couple of more mixers that for students and faculty, so watch out for those. Together with the Digital Studies Institute, we are co-sponsoring a talk by Zsuzsanna Zuboff on the age of surveillance capitalism. And then there's two more events, one on how to do feminist robots, which is going to be a more interactive event, and a talk on Behind the Walls Beyond Discipline, Science, Technology.
That's a conference.
Sorry, that's a conference. That's a conference that's organized by the Science and Technology Studies program. Is STPP involved?
SDS and STPP are co-organizing it. It's the 9th and 10th of April. STS is Science and Technology Studies, and there's a graduate certificate program here. And STPP is Science, Technology, and Public Policy. There's also a graduate certificate program. You get STS in both, but one is more for scientists and engineers and sort of policies more applied. The STS program is more for PhD students in the humanities and social sciences.
And we're happy to explain more of that later. We also wanted to announce that we will launch today our new website, which basically involves Christian and I spending hours and hours cutting images, but you might find yourself on the website due to our labor of image cutting. So check out our new website, still in the testing phase.